The gravity of the time is such that every new avenue of peace, no matter how dimly discernible, should be explored. Never before in history has so much hope for so many people been gathered together in a single organization. You will provide a great share of the wisdom, of the courage, and the faith which can bring to this world lasting peace for all nations and happiness and well-being for all men.
We're here today on Titans of Nuclear with Fiona Riley, who's the Managing Director of Fire Energy and one of the project development experts of the United Kingdom. Fiona, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Brad. I'm not sure where you got that title from.
Well, let's get started. We'd love to just kind of learn about your background and how you got into the sector and all these, experiences that you had early on. Tell us first, where are you from?
I'm from Lancashire in the northwest of England, so very close to the nuclear industry. Grew up there with 3 older brothers and stayed there till I was 18. I went to university, did law, and went to law school in Chester, and then went back to Manchester to do a master's degree in international business law. Qualified as a solicitor, and then
what's a solicitor for our American audience?
Oh, good point. Because going through customs into America is like you can't say the word solicitor; they take it completely the wrong way. So, an advocate, a lawyer, qualified lawyer.
And did you have a specific type of law that you knew you wanted to practice, and did that change over the course of your studies or early career?
I knew I wanted to get into commercial law, but I hadn't really thought about it much further than that. And as you'll see as we talk about my career, I'm always one for let's take an opportunity. Let's dive in. Let's see what happens. So I qualified, and then a job opened up at GEC Alstom, as they were then, and I went to work for them in Leicester, and they did defence work and nuclear work and baggage handling systems. So we did all the baggage handling systems at Heathrow and stuff.
And is that because that's somewhat defense related? Is that part of the thing, or is it just they're a mechanical company, so they know how to move around heavy objects?
The latter.
Okay.
So they developed. When I was working there, they had one of the most advanced robotic arms to go into a nuclear power station to collect the waste, so they could package it for waste disposal. And you went into the hangar where this robotic arm was, and of course it was do not touch anything because you might break something. But this really cool kit being operated by these guys, and so you could see how it was going to work in reality. It was good fun. Good fun. Yeah.
And so that was your first introduction to nuclear and what nuclear power was all about.
Exactly. So I worked on a couple of disputes that we had with clients, and then Sizewell B was coming up to its first outage. So I went to work at Sizewell B on site as the commercial manager for joint venture of Alstom and Framatome.
And what type of plant was Sizewell B?
It's PWR.
And that's the only PWR that's operating in the UK?
Yeah. So it's the last one.
And so then the outage is like, so there might be some unique issues with the outages of it being the only PWR as opposed to, what the industry had historically been more familiar with, which are these gas reactors, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it was the first time I'd come across Westinghouse and how they refueled and their kit that kind of bolted onto the side of the reactor building so the engineers go in and out. And I got to go into the reactor building when they were refueling. Didn't tell my parents till after I'd been in. And no, I'm not glowing in the dark. I'm okay. My meter only recorded 2 millisieverts. I'm fine.
Yeah. It is pretty incredible how because you're in an environment where there was a lot of like activated material, how low the doses actually are. It's like Amazing how they do it. But yeah, they've got it down to a science at this point.
Well, I was literally my head hanging over the reactor looking in while they're refueling, and I still only took a really small dose rate. So it was like,
And what if you lost like a necklace or something? I'm always afraid whenever I look over pools, because they let me bring the cameras into these facilities because of the whole media thing, but I just bring my phone because the phone is as good quality of anything. So I'm like constantly like holding phones over reactors, and it's like my nightmare is that I drop it.
Oh, no. Well, I was like, at that point I was, I knew very little about nuclear, so I'm asking all these questions. I'm like, why have you got life rings on the side of the pool? And they were like, well, if somebody falls in, we've got to get them out. I was like, oh yeah.
So
It's like, I was 24 at that age, and it was like, this is my first time inside a nuclear power plant, and I get to go into the reactor building when they're refueling. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, amazing. Well, water is also an amazing shield. I remember watching a YouTube video one time, and it was like, what happens if you were to jump inside of a nuclear pool? And they're like, you'd have to swim pretty far down to get any exposure.
But one of the guys who was giving me the tour did say, look, let me explain radioactivity to you and the effects of it. And he said you would literally have to swim into the core of the reactor. And even then you'd probably be ill for a bit of time, but then you'd be fine. Like, okay.
And so at that time, so that was pretty early on in your career. Did you know that, did you like latch on to nuclear at that point and say, hey, this is something I think I could really kind of build a base of expertise in? Or were you still kind of dabbling with other options as well?
I was dabbling with other options. And even when I went to Norton Rose, so I was at Alstom for 2.5, 3 years. And I was dealing with these massive disputes as the in-house solicitor. And my boss, the team I worked with was fantastic, and they're still friends to this day. And my boss was like, no, you deal with the dispute. We're not going to hire a law firm. You do it. And I was like, okay.
Wait, before we move on from that, actually, are any of these public? Can we talk about like what types of disputes they were?
Yeah, they're so old. They're so old now. So the main one was around work on power plants and in the UK and delays and construction scheduling.
Always construction delays. I was hoping you'd say something like that. It's like that's everything. That's what drives cost. That's what drives the time. Everything is construction delays. It's like, what's going on here? How can they not just like fix this problem?
Well, it's funny because there were two massive disputes I dealt with, both lasting multiple years. So there was the one at Alstom, and then I moved to Norton Rose, and Alstom said, can we get Fiona back on secondment to help us continue with this dispute? And they were like, yeah, okay. Because
Norton Rose is a law firm specifically. Yeah,
exactly. So Norton Rose Fulbright, as they are now for your American colleagues, because we managed with the Americans. And both that dispute and a dispute I dealt with at Norton Rose in the nuclear industry that lasted 5 years, both were around these concept of alliancing agreements and let's all work together and let's, find solutions to this. And unfortunately, in doing that, the teams on both sides had kind of gone, oh, we can ignore the contract and all these, changes that were happening, and they weren't being recorded properly. So then when you came to this dispute, it became much more complicated because where's the paperwork, where are the records, so although I think there are great benefits of alliancing and partnering and people sharing risk and KPIs, etc., you've still got to administer your contract and do it.
So like alliancing is like a style of development, just like design build or EPC managed, right? And then there's like this alliancing concept, which is almost like a coalition where a bunch of organizations come together and share responsibility. But I guess what you're saying is, unless you're crystal clear, like whose responsibility is what, it's going to lead to problems down the road.
Yeah, I'm trying to explain to people that doesn't mean that when you're on site, you've got to be antagonistic and butting heads, but you've just got to be clear in your communications. And they couldn't quite get the difference. And so it led to a bigger dispute in the end.
And I might be preempting this, but is it like your experiences with the alliancing and just kind of throughout the industry, does it seem like maybe like the whole thing should be vertically integrated, where there's like one company providing a turnkey solution from start to beginning in order to avoid some of these issues, or is that too much for one company to handle?
It's way too much for one company to handle. So we've seen where they've looked at vendor financing on projects, and the technology vendor also becomes a shareholder in the development company. It's just way too much for these companies. So even trying to be an EPC solution is just financially too difficult, which is why in the UK we're looking at funding mechanisms where government can take some of the risks that's extreme risks, so not the day-to-day risks that companies should be able to manage, but if it's an extreme risk, if something happens, because otherwise you just put these companies out of business.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at where Westinghouse ended up with NuGen and Toshiba.
I know.
And I mean, thankfully Westinghouse has survived that and they've come back stronger, but it's a really difficult place for them to be.
And is this a function of the size of the project? Is this model, is it like a vertically integrated model possible for a very small project, maybe like a micro reactor or something like that? Does it change, or is it just the nature of a project is such that you need to pull in these disparate skills and it's just too much for one company to handle?
I think the challenge comes if you want financing, whether it's government financing or private financing. Where's that coming from?
Yeah.
Is it clear for the financiers who's taking responsibility, who's managing things properly? So if you've got an integrated entity with various parties kind of in that integrated entity, how does that work, and what's the joint venture agreements? So you're always going to have some responsibility sitting with each company. So in some ways it's easier to keep it cleaner.
Yeah.
But equally, I don't agree with contracts where you've got so many subcontractors that then you've got one company trying to integrate them all and pull them all together, because that, again, from a programming point of view, just seems to be a nightmare to me.
Yeah. And then are there other mechanisms that you've seen work well? I mean, is there something where it's like the companies are all individual, they've all got their defined responsibilities, but maybe there's some sort of like profit sharing incentive does that work?
Yeah, I think that does work. And I think risk sharing has to go with the profit sharing.
Yeah.
And that way people can manage their own risk. They can own the issues, the risks that they can take responsibility for, and they've got the financial backing to take responsibility for, because that ultimately is at the back of all these things, isn't it? Of how big is your company and how much risk can you take? And you can't, unfortunately, where we've seen some of the big contractors, they just try and push everything down the supply chain. And that doesn't work, because the small guys at the bottom just can't take the risk. You just put them out of business. Right. So you've got to find a way where the risk sharing is throughout the structure and people take appropriate risk for their size.
Got it. So you're learning all these lessons, first at GE Alstom, then at Norton Rose Fulbright. What came next for you?
So I'd been at Norton Rose then for 15 years, set up their nuclear practice, became global head of nuclear, became a partner. Wow. And I was looking around the market, and one of my contacts at PwC said, "Hey, if we create a job for you, would you come and work for us, but you'd have to stop being a lawyer?"
Oh, no.
Possibly. So many discussions, and talking to Richard, who's still a friend, lives around the corner, in fact. I went to work for PwC.
Yeah. And what did they want? What was their big initiative that they went to go pull the best of the best from Norton Rose and nuclear to like come to them? I mean, that's a big poach. That's not a small deal. What was the job?
The job was to head up nuclear globally for their capital projects team.
Wow. And PwC, I mean, we think of them as like a big four accounting firm, but I know they do consulting. What's capital projects? Like, where do they get involved and what's their role?
So the capital projects is the deals and how the money comes into the projects. So how you structure the deals, how you get the money into them, what's the appropriate cost of capital, other people, clearly not me, build financial models. So it's very much that front end. How do you get this working? What's the liaison with governments? How do you get it, whether governments give concession agreements or governments provide frameworks so that projects can be built within those frameworks? All those different aspects. So
and who's the client? Not a specific name, but like what category? Is it the vendor? Is it the EPC? Is it the government? Who's the client of PwC in these cases?
It depends. Quite often it's the development company, so the company that's looking to build the asset. Quite often it can be government. So they continue, I know, to work for the UK government on some of their nuclear deals.
And the development company, when it comes to like these large scale projects, what is the development company? Is it like a joint venture between two other big companies where they've kind of like limited the risk to that joint venture? Is it a financial institution exclusively? What is the developer?
The developer is usually a special purpose vehicle, so a company set up purely to build this asset. And if we could get financing right in nuclear, we would have limited recourse or non-limited recourse to the shareholders. So you've got shareholders buying shares in that company. In a non-nuclear project, you might have some recourse to those shareholders, but basically everything sits within that company and you don't have recourse to the shareholders.
And what does recourse mean in this context?
So if something goes wrong, if you've got delays, who's going to pay for the cost of the delays, etc. And into that special purpose vehicle, you get your shareholders, you might get government concession contracts, but you would also get the financing coming into that vehicle. And quite often that vehicle will be the entity that sells the electricity, or at least has agreements to sell the electricity to third parties. So it's the core of the company that builds the asset.
Got it. Basically. And who works for that company before the money comes in, before we can get all the, the project equity, the project finance, the government, get whatever it is? Where's the operational budget for that entity come in the earliest stages?
In the earliest stages, it comes from the initial shareholders who put equity in. So in the UK, we've seen EDF.
Okay, so like a big utility. Would it be EDF as the utility or EDF as the vendor?
Neither. EDF as the shareholder.
Okay.
And this is where it becomes quite complicated. It's like if you look at Wilbur, which unfortunately isn't currently going ahead, you had Hitachi as the shareholder. Hitachi is the technical provider and the technology provider, but different parts of the Hitachi group taking the different roles. And you need them to almost keep an understanding of what their role is, so that it doesn't all become blurred and merged, because otherwise the financiers start saying, hey, when they start looking at the projects, how's this working? Why is your technology company getting involved with your shareholder? They should be kept separate. They have different governance, they have different responsibilities, and keeping some of that clean.
Yeah. And the reason I'm asking is because part of our mandate is to encourage more nuclear development worldwide. And we want to see more non-nuclear familiar entities, but entities that have a lot of money come in and become development companies. Like, why not? Why shouldn't any big energy intensive company that maybe hasn't thought about nuclear for the last 30 years, why shouldn't they come in and sponsor the original capital that might go into a development company to start getting deals going? And so what are your thoughts on that? Like, who can we reach out to across the world? And how would we, let's say we got in front of their executive board, how do we tell them to do it? How do we tell them to allocate some money to set up an SPV? And where should that money come from?
Okay, there's a million questions in that.
Sorry.
So starting with the initial point, yes, I completely agree. Get non-nuclear companies to invest. This is part of net zero obligations, meeting their net zero obligation. And it's really interesting that you've got some of the big oil and gas companies now looking at nuclear and beginning to say, hey, how do we do this? You've also got the
have any made public proclamations about that, or do we know who's doing that?
I know some of them who are doing that.
Okay, just you. Okay, we'll keep that secret. We'll keep that hush hush off the podcast.
But you've also got the philanthropists like Bill Gates and people like that coming out and saying, if we're going to get to net zero, if we're going to meet our country's commitments, we have to look at nuclear as part of the solution. Not the complete solution. Nobody is saying it's a complete solution, but having integrated systems where you're integrating renewables and nuclear and making them work together, because nuclear is one of the lowest carbon technologies, right? It makes complete sense.
Yeah, I love this. I like the idea that philanthropists are interested, but God, I just want corporations. Like, I want there to be a business drive behind it, so we can like use the market force to, you know, push this forward. I want steel companies.
So I want the finance industry.
Okay, yeah.
And I'm just doing some work through one of my roles is to sit on the Generation 4 International Forum as a UK representative, and I co-chair the Economic Modelling Working Group. And I've got together a task force of largely financiers, but also some government agencies and a few, I've got like one of the representatives from Bloomberg on there, which is an interesting one. And we are looking at making nuclear an investable asset class and addressing the ESGs. So the ESGs are data collection and accounting metrics, which any company who wants to borrow money from the private sector needs to report against these ESGs.
ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance, right? These are like the feel-good things a company should do.
They are. Now, the challenge we've had is there hasn't been a single set of metrics. So every financial institution has had their own metrics.
Yeah.
And a lot of the emphasis comes on the environmental stage, but actually, if you start looking at the full range of ESGs, I think it becomes way more interesting, because the World Economic Forum did a consultation last year to recommend a list of ESGs, and they reported on that consultation. It was done by the big four accounting firms coming together and saying what they thought the ESGs should be. And so in the governance box, you've got, is your company run properly? Is it established properly? Do you have a diverse board? Are you paying your people properly? In the planet section, you've not only got greenhouse gas emissions, but pollutants, land use, water use.
Oh, interesting, yeah.
How you deal with your waste. And of course, nuclear, we have waste, but we deal with it, whereas other energy technologies.
Yeah, and I should,
same way.
Yeah, exactly. And I should mention, hardly any waste. Like, we're talking like 3 orders of magnitude less waste than the next closest energy source.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
and we pre-fund it and we manage it.
I know.
So much experience in dealing with it.
I know. I don't understand. How does nuclear, I mean, maybe this is what you're getting to, but like, how does nuclear not get like extra credit for that? Like, if there was a ranking score tabulation, who's the most ESG, like, I'd say that, like, okay, fine, maybe you don't make it the baseline that everyone has to account for every atom of waste, but if you do, you should get an A+, you know?
So this is the thing. It's not, when financial institutions look at the ESGs, it's not a pass or fail.
Yeah.
So it's like, oh, you've got nuclear waste, you clearly a fail. But sadly, and we've seen this with some of the work going on around taxonomies, it's like, oh, nuclear's got nuclear waste, so we can't put it in taxonomy, the EU being a classic example of where that debate's gone on. And in fact, it's like, no, if you look at it against the ESGs, we actually manage and mitigate our waste.
Yep, exactly.
What you should be doing is making sure that everybody manages and mitigates its waste and deals with it. And, you know, we're beginning to see the solar industry doing a lot of that and pre-funding some of their waste and beginning to manage it. But it's taken them a while to get there. And the wind industry has still got to catch up on some of this stuff. So we need to assess projects individually. And we also need to assess them across their whole life cycle and throughout their supply chain. Because if you've got unethical mining to create to gather one of your components, you know, in your supply chain, that should be reported on, because you know, child mining still exists in this world and we need to get rid of it. So it's a really important issue that needs to be addressed through the ESGs, and we shouldn't focus on, you know, waste and how bad is your particular view of this waste. It's like, what is the facts around this? How much waste have we got? How bad is it? I mean, a lot of nuclear waste can go on landfill. It's so low.
Yes, I know. Well, I mean, my personal take on the nuclear waste is that all of it can go in landfills, including the high level waste. But that's we can address that in another conversation.
Well, I don't want all of it to go in landfill because, one, I want us to recycle. And
okay, yes, okay, touche. Yes, it has a lot of potential. You're right.
And I'm doing some work on medical isotopes through the NIA, which is another hat I've got, Nuclear Industry Association.
Yeah,
And
actually, can we just lay that out for the audience? Because you're all over the place. You're involved in a lot of stuff. You're a very prominent voice in Nuclear UK. So can we just kind of actually just real quick run through the different titles that you're currently involved in?
So currently, I'm managing director of Fire Energy, and I've got some contracts through that, which are pretty cool in some places, including fusion. I've got, I'm a non-executive director of Ansaldo Nuclear. I'm now on the strategy board of the Nuclear Industry Association, and I sit on the Generation 4 International Forum. And previously I did things like I chaired a working group for the UK government on how to finance small reactors and et cetera, et cetera.
Amazing, amazing. Okay, sorry, back to where we were.
So I only realized recently, having been involved in nuclear for 25 years, some of our medical isotopes can come from waste.
Oh my God, yeah. So that's it. That's interesting, right? So what you're saying is you can pick through. So we've got like a smorgasbord of isotopes of all shapes and sizes in normal commercial nuclear waste. And some of those happen to be the same ones that in medical research reactors, they're creating intentionally to for medicine, for saving, I think something like 1 billion lives, like 1 billion have been saved with medical nuclear. Some of those are just sitting in the way. So you're saying you can pick them out essentially.
Yeah. And then some will need to create through research reactors, some will need to create through different processes, but some comes from the waste. So why are we throwing this stuff away? Why are we burying it?
I know.
It makes no sense. So we need to look at this as a proper commercial proposition. If we were a big corporate, we'd be saying, hold on, there's assets over here. Why are we putting it around?
Yeah. Can we brainstorm on that for a second? Because it seems to me, because of the legal landscape in the US, it's like actually just pretty tricky to get, even if you wanted to, it's pretty tricky to get a hold of it. I'm wondering if that's different in the UK, and if there is an entrepreneurial opportunity here where a company could be formed and say, listen, you all guys think of your nuclear waste as a liability. We see it as an asset. We will pay you even a little bit to take it off your hands, bring it to a facility, and then we are going to create these magical commercial properties out of things that you can only create from radioisotopes. Is that possible legally in the UK?
The problem at the moment is we have a ban on reprocessing and recycling. So we need to get past that. So we used to reprocess,
Why is there a ban? I don't understand. Like, why would someone put that in place?
Well, I think America did it first, and of course, America has done it.
Okay, we're not the smartest. Okay, I get it. We're not the smartest.
We sold you our nuclear technology. Where are we going? But you look at the 1, 2, 3 agreements the US put in place with, say, the UAE stopping them doing enrichment and reprocessing. There's this fear around the proliferation risk, but instead of saying let's manage the proliferation risk and get these assets, we're just like, oh, let's bury everything.
Right, because if what you're worried about is the proliferation aspect of reprocessing, just ban that part. Just say you can't separate these isotopes, or you know what, if you are a facility that does this, you're going to be in a country that we like, and you're going to have some inspectors there full time, and there's going to be no, funny business. And it's not like you can just get away with this stuff. Like we were talking, like if anyone wants to do funny business, it'd be like 10 years and $10 billion to even develop the thing that pulled out the dangerous stuff. So it's not like they can just sneak it in.
No, but also, every nuclear facility has nuclear police on it and has different levels of protection. And we have huge processes and procedures to make sure everything is so safe. It's like the safest industry in the world. I don't see why, unless somebody can tell me differently, we can't put in place processes and procedures, and as you say, have inspectors and put security in place and protect these isotopes to deal with the proliferation risk, but still get the benefit out of the waste.
Yeah. Is there so what legally has to happen to overturn that ban? There's like what do you guys have? Do you have sorry, I don't actually know your legal system. Do you have law? Like, I know you have laws, but do you have like a constitution? Like, what's the?
No constitution. We have laws, but I think the first thing is we need a policy change. So that's a government policy.
And can that be something that, like, I know you've got a Department of BEIS, BEIS. Is that something they can just, like, an executive at BEIS can say this is a policy, or do they have to like run it by Parliament first?
They have to consult. They'd have to look at changing the rules. There is some work going on this, as there is in other countries, but we need to make sure we've done a full consultation, keep it open, transparent, and then yes, once it's gone to ministers, it can then get changed. So we'll need a ministerial policy.
But that's still probably, like, to make all of this happen, you probably still need a commercial entity with like that commercial juice to, like, you know, push everything and make it happen, right?
I think the thing we need even before that is an education for people.
Yeah.
Because,
and when you say people, do you mean like everyone in the whole country, or like just enough of the people in the right places to like get informed?
the people in the right places.
Yeah, that's how I feel too. Sometimes when people say education, they're like, we can't do this until everyone loves nuclear. And I'm like, you're not going to get everyone to like it. Some people don't even like Beanie Babies. It's like, come on.
But we have a lot of people in this country who do like nuclear, and they're used to it. And they live near nuclear power plants, and they recognize the jobs and the social and economic development that comes to a region from having a nuclear power plant. So it's really interesting. It's not the general public that I need, I'd want to educate. It's the more of the people in Whitehall, in our civil service, and then more of the ministers to understand. I was talking to some MPs recently, and I was pointing out some of the challenges with some of the renewables technologies, and again saying, we need renewables. I am not advocating to say we don't, but we need to address these issues. And they went, why has nobody told us about this? Why is nobody, and
they've got great marketing.
Yeah. And we need to get better at, it's really interesting. When I put the task force together on McGill, one of the comments that came from the group was, when you write this report, Fee, can you please not be apologetic like the nuclear industry often is?
Yeah.
Can you be positive? Because this has to be used by our boards and our internal processes to try and change some of this stuff. It's got to be positive. It's not going to be so positive that it's unreal, but it's got to be realistic.
I know. I mean, I think you used the right word, unapologetic. And I think like if the nuclear industry wants to get better, they just have to like look at the industries that are successful and not apply their own like little scientific judgment as to like what they think is proper psychology and marketing. You're not psychologists, you're not marketing. So go to the industries that have hired the best people to do this. Like the renewables industry clearly has like the best branding people. So go there, hire them, and do what they say.
Yeah. And it fascinates me the number of people I come across who are like, I my background's in this, but I know the answer to this thing over here. And it's like, okay, you might have educated yourself, you might have been involved along the way in different things, but that's so far from where you started. Are you sure you really understand it? Because I'm the first one to say, I was having a conversation with some of the researchers and clinicians in medical isotope, and I was like, okay, guys, stop. You've completely lost me. I have no clue what you're talking about, because they're talking about this radioisotope, this one, and that. And I'm like, okay, back to basics. And they're like, would it be really helpful if we produced a list for you and how you produce them and what they're used for? I was like, oh my God, that would be a
Yeah, exactly.
I wouldn't even know where to start. And it's that ability to know what you know and know what you don't know.
Yeah.
And bring the right people in, ask the right questions, and you say get the right people involved.
And that's why I always advocate for like more true entrepreneurs getting into the space, not like big old companies saying that they're trying to be innovative, but like new, fresh blood. Because that's what I've seen work in other sectors. Like the people who are like true entrepreneurs, what they do is exactly what you just said. They don't need to know everything. They need to know, what they don't, how to hire, and what they know and what they don't, and then how to hire someone else next to them. Like that's what a good entrepreneur does. And that's what we need more of in the nuclear sector.
And we also need more strategy.
Yeah.
It frustrates me that the industry is very good at saying government needs to tell us what to do. And government's very good at saying, hold on, you're the industry, you need to tell us what to do. So you compare it with, say, the wind industry in the UK, who said, right, here's our 5-year plan, here's our 10-year plan. This is where we want to be in 5 years. This is where we want to be in 10 years. To do that, we need X, Y, Z, and we need A and B from government. Government, can you give us A and B if we can find X, Y, Z?
Yeah.
And we're not very good in the nuclear industry in setting up those strap lines and setting up our ambition and saying, you know, we need 60 gigawatts of new nuclear in the UK to get to net zero. How are we going to do it? What do we need from government to get there? And what are the building blocks? There's too much, government needs to tell us what to do. We need to follow. And I'm like, oh.
Yeah, I know. And I think partially, and not to belabor this point too much, but I think partially is because of, like, if you just look at the nuclear history, there used to be more commercial entities, and then they kind of died off or went out of the way for, you know, whatever reasons. And then everything became about getting like government grants. And like the people left in the nuclear industry are people who are, you know, like scientists and researchers and people who get grants, and they're used to that behavior, that type of interaction with government. And I think literally over the last 40 years, the DNA of the nuclear industry has fundamentally changed from like commercial to like grant seeking organizations.
I think there's a little bit of that. I also think we need to understand how to work better with government. You know, these are strategic assets, no matter whether you've got the laws like, you know, West, which are very much, you've got to have US entities owning or owning majority shares, or where we are in the UK, which not quite that position, but they're still strategic assets. They're key to our electricity system, but they do have risks associated with them and need to be managed properly. And therefore, we need to work with government to say, what do we need from government? And what can the private sector provide? And how do we meld those two things to get to where we need to be? And we're not very good at that. And I think we need some policy changes. We need some drive. We need some ambition. The drive and ambition is going to come from the private sector, not government. The policy changes and the frameworks have to come from government. And how do you get those two things to the same point at the same time to allow us to move these projects forward? And how do we then bring in the finance industry?
Yeah. Okay. So let's circle back a little bit there. Tell me about your transition. Well, actually, just so in the interest of completeness, was there any like big capstone to your work at PwC that you wanted to highlight? And then I want to hear about the transition to your own practice.
There were some pretty cool deals at PwC. I'm not sure how much I can talk about them. I mean, at Norton Rose, I worked on the BRCA project, which was pretty cool. Yeah. Spent a lot of time flying to the UAE. And at PwC, I actually worked on BRCA in a slightly different role. I left there because they said, would I go on secondment to go and work for a non-nuclear company and be their development company and run this development company under a private equity business? And I went to meet the family the principal who ran the family private equity business. And he said, well, why don't you come and work with me instead? So I moved over, and that allowed me to then become a non-exec of the Nuclear Industry Association and do the work for government as well on the side. And that was to build a cable from Iceland to the UK to bring in hydro and geothermal power to the UK.
Electric cable.
Yeah.
Right.
A huge electric cable.
Yeah, like $1 billion electric cable.
2 billion, yeah.
That's cool.
We couldn't get the two governments to the same point at the same time. So yeah. I was there for 2.5 years, and then I've worked out private equity and government don't necessarily work well together, because private equity wants things to happen really quickly and governments don't. So it's a real challenge to get some of these projects off the board. And it's the same in nuclear as it is with big cables, as it is with anything, particularly where you've got multiple governments involved.
And is this a function of just general government bureaucracy, or is this related to the size of the project? Like if it were an undersea cable that was only 50 million instead of 2 billion, could it have got done faster? Or is there just like a fixed time period that you just can't get past?
The problem was we didn't fit within any already created policy. So we were trying to change the policy to get the project to fit within a policy that wasn't designed for a cable project.
And do you think SMRs are the same story, that they don't fit into a policy and then a new policy needs to be created? Or do you think it's workable under the existing framework?
No, I think SMRs are very much backed by government, and they've made clear statements about wanting to develop small reactors, both light water and then moving into advanced reactors. And then their ambition is to then look at fusion. And we have one of the world's leading fusion company. We've got other fusion companies that are, well, some of them have been in existence for quite a few years now, and so there's a roadmap which the NIA drafted, which went from large reactors plus small light water to advanced reactors to fusion, and what that could look like. And I had an interesting discussion this week with somebody from government about, well, if we crack fusion, does that mean we no longer need fission? And I said, no, you need them both, because they potentially do slightly different things. And particularly, my engineering knowledge is limited, but my understanding is fusion are generally going to be bigger plants. So you're still going to need the small reactors to go into some pretty cool places that other reactors couldn't go, fusion reactors couldn't go. And so I think we need to look at our system much more holistically and work out, or our systems around the world, to work out where renewables are appropriate, where small reactors are appropriate, and where larger reactors are appropriate.
Yeah, I think that's a good, at first glance, that seems like a good way to characterize, why, SMRs would still be necessary in a world with fusion. I've got a few others, but we'll keep that for another conversation as well. But I think that's a pretty good just like first point there. Okay, so then at Fire Energy, like what's the main like driving, imperative behind your work there?
Do cool stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, yeah. So that's literally what I was going to ask next, is like, what kind of stuff do you want to work on? Like, where do you put yourself out there to get involved in projects? What types of forums, what types of places, what type of companies are you talking to?
I already am a consultant to a company, which is Medano. So I've worked with them for the last couple of years, and then I'm helping on a fusion project. I've helped with a technology park. I've helped with some government thinking around financing.
Tell me about technology park. What's a technology park?
So Westinghouse in the UK has a site called Springfields, where
their fuel production facility.
They are, but they have an awful lot of space on that site to do other stuff. So they looked at the site and said, look, this is a nuclear license site. We are a site licensee. We're an operator. Who wants to come and build stuff on our site? And so I was looking at some of that and how that could work with some of the government principles. And they've now got that set up. It's been set up for a couple of years now, and they are looking for projects to want to come and build on their site.
Amazing. I love the concept of technology parks in general. I mean, I love like the idea of national labs in general. I think if you put a lot of smart people together, and I think I especially like technology parks, because if you put a lot of like discrete different technologies and projects that all have this like commercial benefit, there's a lot of mixing and mashing of ideas, seeing how you can work together. Oh, let me run over to that company that specializes in advanced manufacturing. Just let me ask them a few questions. Let me take that guy out to lunch who specializes in the fuel cycle. Let me figure out what's going there. And when you're able to bring a lot of people together, and then, of course, the park itself needs electricity, right? So, like, maybe that's a first customer for a new type of power plant. So, like, I think there's a lot of, I hate to use the word synergies, but I think there are. And I think these types of establishments should be encouraged. So, is the government behind technology parks? Is that like the government also helps out in some way, or no?
Yeah. So, for Westinghouses, there are potentially grants available, government grants for if it's R&D activities or things like that. The other technology park we've got in the UK, which had some exciting news last week, is the fusion park at Culham.
Oh yeah, I think I saw something in the news about that. What's going on there?
So General Fusion, which is the Canadian fusion company which Jeff Bezos invests in, is going to build its prototype in Culham, in Oxford. So again, It's that synergies of ideas and having people around and being able to, UKEA is the world's leading fusion project at the moment, and there's a lot of money going into the private sector. So how can those two entities help each other? How can UK work with other entities to help them develop fusion quicker? So there's all those ideas you were talking about of sharing information and, what about this? Have you thought about this? How does this work? So there's lots of good stuff happening around technology parks. We've got other technology parks looking at hydrogen. We've got so in the northeast looking at a mix of bringing in different energy ideas to one technology park. So again, it's how do you was going to say fuge, but that's really bad. How do you bring together all those activities and make the best out of them, and create hubs of excellence where also you then have the socio-economic development that sits around it, and you've got people working in those areas, and it brings people to those areas, which of course pushes up jobs and pushes up salaries, and then creates greater infrastructure around them, and really helps with what we call the levelling up agenda in the UK.
Yeah, and tell me more about the levelling up agenda, because I know, like the UK, like the US, has had some, let's say, geographically neglected areas because of shifts in industry. Is there a geographic focus to some of this work where, we can help some of the communities that maybe kind of get left behind from, the shutting down of coal or steel or other industries?
Yeah, definitely. So for the nuclear industry, there's a group called the Northwest Nuclear Arc, which is looking at the northwest of the UK and also Wales, and how that can work as a community and develop wider nuclear projects. But the levelling up agenda is basically the Midlands and the north of England, and making sure we can deal with those areas that have been neglected in the past, and we've had either lots of unemployment or really low wages, which impacts people's lives. So how do we take some of there's a lot of wealth generated in the southeast around London, where we've got the financial institutions and the city and everything else, and how do you spread this out across some of the country as far as possible? Because London is probably always going to be the banking centre, although
of course
the government's new UK infrastructure bank is being set up in Leeds as part of this pulling things out of London. But what else can we do for the country? How do we bring back manufacturing and engineering, which we've got some great manufacturing and engineering companies, but some of our manufacturing capability has been neglected over the last few years, and we need to really look at that and consider how government and industry can work together again to bring manufacturing back to the UK. And I think, small reactors play a big part in that, because if we're looking at building factories where you can literally build reactors that can almost plug and play, that's where I think we need to be going as an industry, and start producing products rather than having long construction on-site manufacture, which comes with all the cost overruns and the delays.
Yeah, no, I love it. I mean, that is the promise of SMRs, right? And yeah, and if you can set up the factory in those like historically neglected regions to get more good, like, I mean, like, think I can just only imagine if you're going to be pumping out little, nuclear factories or little nuclear plants coming out of a factory, like how many good like pipe welding jobs is that, or pipe fitting and welding and electrical work? I mean, I could just imagine like hundreds, if not thousands of like, I mean, these like, call them blue collar jobs maybe, but like these are well paying, like these are good paying jobs. It's like because you got to do it right. They're skilled trade labor. I mean, this is good stuff. I mean, this is the type of thing that not just the UK, but any government has got to be thinking about. And then the benefit isn't just, the jobs. It would be worth it maybe just for that. But the benefit is what comes out of clean and first of all, cheap energy, clean water, everything you ever want. I mean, it's like the perfect solution. All I want to do is like shout in the ears of like anyone who will listen, like, come on, let's do this.
Let's build.
Yeah, let's build. Right. That should be, God damn it. That's the slogan. That's the slogan of the new nuclear industry. Let's build.
Let's get on with it.
Yeah, that's amazing.
But it's also, playing to regions where school kids may not have aspirations of going to university, but they can have apprenticeships and they can do on-the-job learning, or you can do a mix of university and apprenticeship. You're giving people the opportunities. My view has always been you can't force people to take opportunities, but if you give people opportunities, then that's all you should have to do, because people should want to go and take those opportunities and better themselves and do more and add to society. And as you say, then you've got the bigger impacts of clean energy and net zero and meeting our NDCs. And
yeah. So tell me, when it comes to building, when it comes to new nuclear development, what do we see in the UK landscape? And when does project finance? That's something I've always wanted to ask you, is like, when is the right time for project finance to get involved? Like, what stage of the development cycle? What needs to be established? Does a company need to have a license? Does it need to have a land? When do you start having the conversations with the capital that'll come in?
You start having the conversation during the very early development phases. I think if you're doing it right, the finance community isn't going to commit until you've got certain things in place. But at least they're engaged and they can see things are moving and they can see things are progressing. And I've heard some people in the industry say, "Oh no, it's too early phase to bring these guys in." It's like, it's not too early to have those conversations and to plant the idea, because they've got their own processes to go through. They've got to set it up internally and move this through their own systems. Yeah. So, I mean, there's always been this concept of financial close, which is when the big money comes in and you're ready to put spades in the ground. But there are questions as to what financial close is. And historically, it means you've got all your permits, all your licenses. You've obviously got your land. You know what you're building. You know what your construction program is. You should know what your design is, but historically, some projects haven't known what their design is, and it's gone wrong. You should know
got them in trouble sometimes. Yeah.
You need to set up your decommissioning program, because you need to start thinking about what that looks like and having a plan in place, and then putting a decommissioning fund in place. And it's making sure everything's in place so that you are ready to put that spade in the ground to start the construction.
Yep. And then how does it maybe shift a little bit with something like these micro reactors? I mean, I've seen there's like 50 companies in the US, that are nuclear startups, quote unquote, and some of them are micro reactors, 1, 2 megawatts, 10 megawatts, whatever it is. Is it, do you see a path that's a little faster and easier with them? I think they still have to build stuff. They probably still have to like lay a foundation and do something, but does it just, in my opinion, the licensing part should go relatively quickly for these reactors, because the energy is lower, the risk is lower. I know it doesn't always work that way, but I think it should. And so let's imagine a world where there is like a true graded risk approach. And you can get a fast track license for a smaller reactor. What are the next stages then? Maybe you don't have the license yet, but you think you'll have it within a couple of years. What are the next stages then to kickstart an actual project?
So getting your license is probably one of the last things you do, because you need to understand your construction process so that can feed into license. And the difference between licensing here and licensing in the US is you have different licenses for different phases of the project. We don't. We have a nuclear site license. Right. So you need to be able to show R&R as a regulator that where you're going to put this has, and you don't have to say have an operator in place from day one, which has been a misunderstanding from some people. But you do need to know how you're going to build up an operator, how you're going to get that capability to operate. How are you going to show R&R that you are compliant? Because although we have one license, there are various hold points within that license where R&R can stop the project and say, hold on, guys, you haven't got this quite right. You need to redo, you need to, we need to check that if you've got concrete is properly set and laid properly. So for us, getting your license is one of those final things that almost comes just before financial close, with all your parenting and all your construction contracts, a huge number of contracts, and including all your financing contracts and how all the financing fits together.
So you put the financing contracts first and then you get the license?
No.
Other way around.
To get your license just before you sign all your contracts, including your financing contracts.
I see. So you time it so it's all happening about the same time.
Yeah. So the night when deals closed is the night when everybody's working through the night and going, oh my God, do we need to make amendments? Where can we close this project? Can we get all the money available? It's a bit like buying a house. Can we get all the money available so we can start this thing tomorrow? Yeah.
Amazing. And then what is like, and I think I was alluding to this question before, it's a big curiosity of mine in terms of like setting up these SPVs, these development entities that are really going to be the ones like pushing to build. Let's build. Remember our slogan. The money that's involved, though, it seems to me like just to line up all of these contracts, the EPC contracts, the financing agreements. It seems to me that there's probably, and you should know, I mean, you're the lawyer, that there's probably like, I don't know, like what, like $500,000 in legal fees. Am I in the right ballpark? Is it more? Is it less? And how do we get enough confidence to get that money in the bank, to get those things started so that when the license comes through, everything's ready to go?
The problem is you need that initial investor who can pay for that development phase.
Okay, so that's really step number one. Find somebody who's willing to. And am I right in the ballpark in terms of what the fees are? I'm off.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I mean, I think the cheapest you could get through a full development phase, including lawyers' fees, consultants' fees, banks' lawyers' fees, because you pay their fees as well as your own, and getting all your permits and licenses, you're probably at £500 million.
$500 million. So you're saying 500 million. And that's for a gigawatt scale reactor. You're not saying for one of these like baby reactors would still be that, right?
For any reactor.
Say that again?
For any reactor.
But then that precludes anyone from ever developing an SMR, right? Because you can never pay back $500 million if your project is only a $100 million project, right?
But that's where you've got to start looking at these things and saying, what's the right size and how are we building it? So the argument with microreactors that I've heard other people talk about is you're not then looking to build a reactor that's going to go on the grid. So you don't need to pay your costs to the national grid to connect to the grid potentially. You don't need some of the permits that go with that. So what are you going to build your microreactor to do? Is it going to be with a hospital? Is it going to be with a school? Is it going to be, how do you get public acceptance for that type of principle, which we've not historically had? How do you get government policy to line up with that type of principle? There's a lot of work that goes into these things. I mean, I think it's pretty well known that Hitachi on Wilva didn't get
$2 billion or something, yeah.
Billion.
I didn't get it. I know, but to me, that doesn't make any sense. And I'm trying to, like, that's what we're trying to do. Like, and I think part of this podcast is trying to discover, like, how do we break out of this? How do we make it feel like a wind project? And I think maybe that's where I got that number from. Maybe $1 million goes into the early development costs. Let's say for a 50 megawatt, you know, a few wind turbines go up or something. How do we get nuclear to feel a lot more like that? And let's put aside the nuclear license and the fees associated with that for a second, but still account for all of the other development fees like lawyers and project finance and stuff. And is it possible that any of that money can be like contingent on close of the deal, or does all of it have to be paid up front?
There's some costs you're going to have to, if you look at a normal reactor and you look at building a normal reactor, you've got early lead items that need to be paid for up front rather than held off. There's talk with the regulated asset-based model that we've been looking at in the UK as to whether, so one of the advantages of the regulated asset-based concept is you can start servicing your financing through the construction period. You don't have to wait for the plant to be operational, which obviously massively reduces the cost of capital because you're not accumulating interest. There is an argument that you could possibly bring that forward slightly and start the regulated asset base somewhere through the development phase rather than waiting to the end of the development phase. That will require certainty of design and certainty of knowledge that you're going to get to financial close to put some of this stuff in place. So it won't be day one, but it might be 2-3 years down the line rather than. Now, the figure I got from the finance community, because I did ask this question of what the costs, the development costs for a wind farm were 30 million.
Okay.
So that was the figure that, what's the differential? There's quite a lot of the money goes into the nuclear licensing. There's a lot of money goes into planning and getting public acceptance. Now, wind farms still have to get public acceptance, but it doesn't seem to take as long. It doesn't seem to have the same challenges to it, particularly if it's offshore. So there are lots of these things that you can start chipping away at on nuclear licensing. And one of the things I love to talk about, because there's a huge misconception about this, is everyone says, well, GDA can take you 3-4 years, and then you've got to do nuclear site license. There is absolutely no legal requirement in this country to go through a genetic design assessment.
Yep.
You can go straight into site licensing. Now, some of the things that are covered in the genetic design assessment would then be covered in your site licensing process, but you can deal with it all at the same time and aim to get your site license in 2 years, potentially. You've got a really set design and the key to this is you've got your documentation in order. So when you present it to the regulator, they can just look at it and say, yeah, we've got questions. The cost of this stuff goes up when you start having, well, what do you mean by that? How does that work? Our regulator isn't prescriptive. So they've got to understand the concepts, they've got to understand what's being built and why it's being built and how you're going to run the site and what your operator is going to look like and how all that stuff's going to come together. So you can reduce the cost of this stuff. And that's some of the stuff I advise on, is how to bring down some of those costs and to avoid some of the pitfalls that we've seen on other projects. We're never going to get to the 30 million, but we might get to something lower than $500 million. In fact, we can definitely get to lower than $500 million. But you've also got to remember that the life of a nuclear plant is much, much, much longer than a wind farm.
Yeah, but a discount rate says that all of that money in the end of life doesn't matter.
I'm not sure about that. If you're getting government funding mechanisms.
Oh, if you get government funding, sorry. I was thinking strictly in the private sense. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. All right. Well, we've done pretty well here, covered a lot of topics. Before we wrap up, is there anything else that you just kind of like to leave our audience with?
I guess the big thing for me is how do we solve this ESG issue and make sure that companies in the nuclear sector and the other sectors are properly reporting against ESG and creating that balanced scorecard and stop some of the greenwashing. That to me is vital for moving some of this ahead and to educate those who need to be educated so they can understand, they can move things quicker and get rid of some of the slow processes that we have that we do not need.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Fiona Riley, thank you so much. Looking forward to seeing you hopefully sometime soon in person. Yeah, welcome to the club, Titans of Nuclear.
Thanks, Brett. Take care.
And initiate at least a new approach to the many difficult problems that must be solved in both private and public conversation if the world is to shake off the inertia imposed by fear and is to make positive progress toward peace.